29th, year 2020. This is show number 1242. I am your host, Shawn King, joined as always by my beautiful wife, Melissa.
Hello.
In the orange, in the handmade orange poncho?
Yes.
Poncho? All right, good. On tonight's show, we're going to talk to our good friend Jim Dalrymple of The Loop at loopinsight.com. We pre-recorded the interview with Jim this afternoon. He had to go to the airport, so we did a pre-recorded part of it. And if you're not interested in Neil Young, when he starts talking about Neil Young, just move on. Go get a beverage because he rants for like 15 minutes. He just goes off on Mr. Young. We'll talk to him about that. And Apple's incredible, phenomenal earnings that they announced yesterday. Over the last 3 months, Apple made $1 billion a day. $1 billion a day in revenue. Just utterly incredible. A couple of little minor bumps in the road. Macs were down a little bit. iPads were down a little bit. But China was up quite a bit. iPhone sales were up. Services were huge. Wearables were huge. Apple's just going gangbusters. So we'll talk to Jim about that later on in the show. And then I did a photography class this past weekend, and I got some interesting questions from people. And one of the things I want to talk about is this idea of things you shouldn't learn in photography. Things you don't need to learn as a beginning photographer. And I love Melissa's like, huh?
No, I could hear you. I've heard you say that to people.
So it's not just don't learn too much, but there's things you don't need to know as a beginner. This is my opinion. I see some of these things, or a lot of these things, in so-called beginner classes. And I really disagree with the characterization of these aspects of photography as being beginner things. I think of them as more advanced or more intermediate than beginner stuff. And I'll tell you what I mean a little bit later on. I want you folks to watch Melissa when I do this. This was full yesterday.
Oh, it was not.
It was full of caramel.
Oh my gosh, it
yesterday.
wasn't.
Homemade caramel.
It was never full.
That I made with my own two hands.
He's lying.
Who do you believe, me or her?
I haven't had that much.
Look at all the fingerprints in that.
No, that's not fingerprints. That's the spoon scraping up the side.
If we did forensic, you'd see her fingerprints are embedded.
And
in
the
all
14-year-old.
Mostly you, though. Embedded in all this.
I can't believe you would embarrass me like this. Oh, actually, no. Yes, I do.
I'm teasing. She didn't eat all of that. It just, I think I saw the mason jar in the fridge and thought, oh, this will be funny. It's actually about half full, and you've had about a quarter of it.
Oh, of what's left?
What's left? Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Rory nabs some as well.
It's very funny. It's really
delicious.
good. And it's so, I thought caramel would be hard to make. It's dead simple. You can make it in 10 minutes. Let it cool down for 45 minutes to an hour, and you put caramel on everything. I made a strawberry pie. We put caramel all over it. Ice cream, caramel.
Put it on a spoon and just eat it.
Stuff it in your face, caramel. So, yeah, if you want my caramel recipe, it's dead simple. Send me an email to Shawn at yourmaclifeshow.com. Dave D. Shawn, you're losing. Give it up. I know. But I was teasing her. She didn't eat all of it. I saw this story. I thought this was really interesting. UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, which is the liberal university in California, famous for the student protests in the 60s, things like that. They have a course in adulting. It's so popular they had to turn away 200 students. It's a course in adulting, how to be an adult. The class is so popular. I wanted to feel like I wanted to feel prepared. Like I know what I'm doing, and I know how to be an adult. Said Allegra, who's a pre-med junior at Cal. You can know as much as you want about physics or biology or English. That doesn't help when you need to do taxes or figure out what to eat. The instructor said the topics are managing time, managing money, improving relationships, fitness, nutrition, mental health, self-care, self-love, sleep. Oh, my God! This should not be a class you're turning people away from. It should be frickin' mandatory.
Well, and it shouldn't be in university.
Thank you. That was going to be my next point. Where should it be?
A high school, home.
Well, the problem with home is that your parents may not know how to do this stuff. My mother probably didn't know how to teach me about taxes, finances. She never had any money.
Mm-hmm.
She never had a mortgage. She never had any of that kind of stuff, so she couldn't teach me that.
Oh, but I mean,
and when it came to relationships, my mother sucked at that. So, parents are not necessarily a good way of teaching this.
Yeah, that's true.
I'd much rather have, trained psychologists or whoever
they
it might
send
be.
the work home for the parents to look at.
They could do that. The parents could do it too, but it's definitely, in my opinion, at the very least, a high school class, and I'd say even junior high school, at least with the money management type stuff. It'd be great if kids had a class where they were taught what a bank is.
Well, functional math instead of trigonometry.
That's right.
Maybe you don't want to do that complex math.
Just teach kids, here's what a savings account is. Here's what compound interest is. Here's how you would use those things. Here's how the stock market works. I would have liked to learn that in high school. Just not so I could buy things, but just it's so important in our economy and conversation about things. How does it work? How are stocks bought and sold? I kind of think I know, but I don't actually know. Things like that. What affects the stock? That kind of stuff.
That's true.
And relationships. We're taken out of we get out of high school, and so many of us go to college. We have no clue how to deal with this new group of strangers from all over the world, all over your city. That now I suddenly have to get along with these people from different socioeconomic groups and racial and religion and that kind of stuff. And no one's ever taught me how. I got to sort of figure it out myself. And it causes a lot of stress. So let's teach this kind of stuff, like you said, functional math, functional things in high school at the very least, not in a college university class that you're turning people away from too.
Turning people away from, yeah.
Sherry says, like I said last week, my dad was a bank manager. And I'm still crap at money.
Yeah,
Can't
really?
teach the unwilling.
Yeah.
Mosquito. I don't remember being taught basic personal economics in school, but it's fairly well equipped to figure that stuff out. I wasn't.
Did you do commerce?
No.
I took commerce.
Well, we didn't. What was commerce?
Commerce was a high school course. It wasn't a university. I did it in high school.
But what did the class teach you?
Oh, obviously nothing because I can't remember. It's a long time ago. I'm old, so high school was a long time ago. And they taught it in Australian, and I don't speak Australian anymore.
Was the commerce class like gross domestic product and
it was
economics
about world
and
economy
okay.
and understanding all of that stuff, yes.
I took political economics in college, which is really cool, of how governmental policies affect economies and things like that.
That's cool.
But it had nothing to do with my personal knowledge of taxes and mortgages.
Yeah, if you go to a bank, it doesn't help that you know how the gross national,
they don't care. They don't care. The idea of credit cards and why they're important in some ways. That to a certain degree you should have a credit card because it helps you this credit score. Like, what's a credit score?
That's right.
How is that?
And our son Damon, like he frets about money. Yep. Like he truly does. And I actually said to him, I said, it's good that you are fretting about it. I don't want you to, but it's good because he doesn't he hates being in debt. So it's like, way to go.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing.
He doesn't just go, oh well, whatever, and then get himself into trouble. And Dave D, how to buy a house.
Yeah, exactly.
There's so many hidden costs and so many. It's a very long and stressful process to buy a house.
I've never bought a house. I have no clue what the process is. I don't know what a real estate agent does, what a buyer does, a seller does, what escrow is. I don't know any of that stuff because for no other reason, no one in our family ever bought a house. We never had the money. We always lived in married quarters. When I was living at home with my dads, they were in the Navy, and so we moved a lot. So we were always in what's called PMQs or private married quarters. So to this day, I don't know what that stuff is.
I think escrow is an American term.
We don't have that in Canada?
No, I don't think escrow. See? Escrow is in America.
Sherry can maybe help us out.
Yeah, maybe Sherry could help us.
But yeah, all that kind of stuff, that basic, this is how you live your life stuff. Relationships, how to deal with your boss, how to negotiate a raise, how to do a job interview, how to argue.
The thing about doing it at the university level is schools can get very tricky at school because there are a lot of parents that may look at some of the content and go, I don't want you to teach that's not. I don't agree,
But-
or they might take the teachers to task.
But
and
at the
about
college
things.
level, don't you choose your own classes?
That's what I'm saying. If you're in university, you choose to do
Oh,
it on
I see.
your
Okay,
own.
you're saying
There's
if
no parents that are going to cause challenges for a system.
you couldn't do that in high school. But I mean, that'd be okay if you don't want to put your kid in these classes in high school. That's fine. Your kid will be disadvantaged compared to his peers when it comes to this kind of stuff. It's like why I think sex ed should be taught. But if you don't want to put your kid in sex ed, your kid doesn't have to go to sex ed. It should be a voluntary elective kind of thing, but it should be offered from both the physiological point of view, but also the emotional and
safety,
all that kind of stuff. Yeah, you don't have to put your kid through that class. Mosquito, university's too late to teach this stuff. It could be.
Could be, yeah. But a lot of, the kids there are just 18.
True.
So,
but at least teaching the basics could be a way of starting them down the path, and then there'll be a more advanced class in college. Commerce 101 or whatever it is. Because unfortunately, I think we waste a lot of time teaching kids things that they're never going to use. I mean, I've never done trigonometry in my entire life after I left high school. I've never done calculus. I've never done sines or cosines or tangents. I still know those frickin' words.
It was fun, though, when you
No,
had
it
to
wasn't.
do
It was awful because I
that.
can't visualize that stuff.
Oh.
Geometry,
You probably hated it.
I breezed through everything in school except geometry because I couldn't visualize the spatial orientation of these signs and angles and that kind of stuff. I had to work my ass off at geometry. I probably put in 4 or 5 hours a week just trying to get through geometry. It was so hard on me. But I'm not saying you should get rid of those classes. Those classes should become electives because if you're a math kid and like math, go nuts. Go take trig. Go take calculus, algebra. That's great. But recognize that the vast majority of us don't ever use that stuff ever again. I've never had to figure out the hypotenuse of a triangle in my life, yet I still know a squared equals b squared. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. I shouldn't need to know that anymore.
Yeah, but if you're going to go on to be an engineer or a designer,
That's right.
Good thing to know.
It is, if you're going to go on to be one of those things.
Yeah.
But I'm not. Why
No.
teach the skills for the jobs that few people are going to be using when everyone needs to know how to do relationships? Everyone needs to know how to balance your checkbook. Everyone needs to know, that kind of
Taxes
stuff.
and
Taxes
things.
and things. So, folks, later in the show, we're going to talk about what you don't need to know about photography. But up next, in a recorded interview, we're going to talk to our good friend Jim Dalrymple of The Loop at loopinsight.com about Apple's monstrous quarter and what comes next. All that and much more coming up. This is your Mac Life. We're recording this on Wednesday afternoon. This is a pre-recorded interview with our good friend Jim Dalrymple of The Loop at loopinsight.com. Jim, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Shawn. How are you?
I'm good. Just out of curiosity, did you actually listen into the conference call, the earnings call yesterday?
So I usually do, but yesterday I couldn't because I was so angry with Neil Young that I was I was seriously. I wrote about it. I wrote about the earnings, and then I just kept going on Neil Young.
You did have a good rant about Neil, that's for sure.
But by the time I was done, the earnings call was over. So
that's funny. We'll definitely talk about the Neil Young piece on the Loop a little bit later. The earnings call was well above anyone's guesstimates or analysis or anything. Apple, it's a much of a cliche, hit it out of the proverbial ballpark. They made $1 billion a day for 92 days.
Can you imagine?
That's insanity. Now, would you say, as some have, the iPhone is back and everything is back? Apple, Tim Cook said that they've grown across every single geographic region. That it's now just, he didn't say this, but people are assuming this is now just straight up from here. They're going to be a $2 trillion company. Is there anything in all that, or do you think that we should be a little calm and realize this was one holiday quarter?
Well, see, I look at this a bit different than what some other people do, because those are the same people that, said, oh my God, the iPhone is dead. And, I mean, no, this is part of the cycle of things that happen. And if you look at, I think it was a year ago, no, not, I forget which quarter. I had it all mapped out, but Mac sales actually were above.
Yeah.
Mac sales have been doing very well. And this quarter they're down.
Yep.
So that what is now the Mac doomed?
That's right.
No,
That's right.
it's just one of those things. iPad is down.
Yep.
Actually, iPad is down more than what Mac is down. Are they screwed with the iPad?
Yep.
No.
11% down on iPad year-over-year revenues.
Yeah, and services is up like $2 billion for services. So, does that mean that services are going to continue to go up? Not necessarily, but yes, we know it will.
Yeah.
Because of everything that services includes. And, what was services? $12.7 billion.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when services, and this wasn't so, services before actually being a category, when they had a couple of $1 billion in services, they were great. Now they have $12-13 billion in services
in a quarter. Remember, this is a quarter, kids. This is 3 months, 90 days. And remember, services are Apple TV Plus, Apple Music, News, the other things, the non-product thing.
Right.
As folks have said,
iCloud.
Yeah, whatever other things that you pile on top of your Apple devices. And as long as Apple keeps selling devices, services is going to continue to go up.
Absolutely.
I'm a little less exuberant over services. We went up double digits again for the 14th quarter. It doesn't really matter because the law of small numbers is it's easy to get 50% increase if you started at 1. 2 is 50%. So although Apple is getting to that point where they're going to have so many people using their services that it's going to look like services revenue or services percentage are slowing down. And of course, once they drop under that double-digit phrase, people are going to go, "Oh, services are now a failure." But it's just because they've gotten so big. Apple has now got. Tim Cook said there's 1.5 billion installed base of devices. So there's 1.5 billion Apple devices hardware out there, and that's whether it's AirPods and Macs and iPads and iPhones. But that's a lot. We keep coming back to this idea of us old timers. Remember when Apple sold 100,000 Macs in a quarter, and they put out T-shirts.
Oh my God!
They put out an ad in the New York Times because hey, we sold 100,000 in a quarter, and now they're doing that every 14 seconds.
It's just, it's kind of crazy to think about how much money they made. I mean, like you said, they made over $1 billion a day for the quarter.
Almost $12,000 a second for 90 days.
$12,000 a second.
Just give me a year of that. Sorry, just give me an hour of that. Apple, I'd be perfectly happy.
Hey, I wouldn't bother you again. You'd never hear from me.
I never fucking call you again. I'd leave skid marks out of the studio, dude. You kidding me? You'd never hear from me again. Except new phone, who dis? That'd be me.
Well, yeah.
So it is.
I mean, it's an incredible amount of money, and it's not something that all companies can do. I mean, services itself is a separate company now.
Yeah, absolutely. All of this stuff, wearables, services.
Yeah,
they could all be separate companies. Apple, according to revenue by category, the iPhone increased, now 61%. It had dropped to about 53%. Services is the next biggest. So the services revenue, along with the wearables revenue, is bigger than the Macintosh right now. Is that a concern?
Or the iPad as well.
Yeah.
No, it's not a concern. I mean, the Mac has continued to grow, and it's still growing. I think that whole 2019 was a pro year for Apple, just because of all the pro devices that they released. But I'm not concerned about the Mac at all. I know that there will be people that come out and say, well, now the Mac is starting to falter.
Yep.
And, I mean, but like I said earlier, those are the same people that come out and say, oh, the Mac is reigning supreme. Those people go from one extreme to another on a quarter by quarter basis. And if you listen to how Tim talks about it, and how CFO talks about it, they're more guarded on both sides of that, so they're going down the middle.
I would say measured.
Well, okay, measured. That's a better word. They're more measured with what they say, because they go right down the middle. Yes, it was a good quarter, but they're not, like blowing the doors off of anything, partying and stuff because they had a good quarter. But they're also not ready to burn the place down because they had a bad quarter. And that's what the financial markets seem to do. They either want to, blow it up or burn it down.
Yeah, that's right.
And I just don't look at it like that. Now, if we have, a year where, Mac sales just plummet every single quarter, and now all of a sudden it went from, 7.5 billion down to 1 billion. Okay, we got a problem.
Yeah.
But it's always around the same thing,
The only concern I heard on the conference call was, and it's a good concern, it's a problem, but it's not an awful problem, is Apple can't make some of their stuff fast enough. They couldn't make Apple Watches fast enough, especially, interestingly enough, the Series 3, which is still on sale at an under $200 U.S. price point, which means that's the most popular Apple Watch being sold, and the AirPods and AirPods Pro. They can't make those fast enough. And they don't know, when it comes to AirPod Pros, when they're going to be able to catch up. Now, that's a bad thing, because it means that they're leaving money on the table. And I think generally that's not true when we think about when they couldn't make Macs fast enough. People would wait for the Mac. They would wait for them to get in stock. But I think there's a slight danger with Apple when it comes to Apple Watch and wireless AirPods, that if a customer is told they can't get it for a month, they might go and buy a Fitbit, or they might go and buy a competitor's product. So that's the only concern I see from Apple's point of view.
Well, I mean, it's not like they're trying to hold back.
Yeah.
I mean, they are trying to get as much produced as they can. And I don't know that that's actually true about going to a Fitbit. I think you will find that some of these people are actually coming from Fitbit.
Well, I actually had friends this Christmas who couldn't get an Apple Watch up here in Canada fast enough, and they bought 2 Fitbits instead. And they're very happy with their Fitbits.
Yeah, well, they're saying that, but they're not.
Yeah,
Uh,
these are fine. No,
they're
these are
they're
fine.
yeah, they're actually ashamed, and they won't even show them in public. They probably have a cutout of an Apple Watch face over top of the Fitbit.
That's right, exactly.
Oh, you want to see my rings? Hold on, let me change the screen here.
They got an Apple Watch skin on their Fitbit. That's right.
Yeah.
But
No, I
that's
mean the Fitbit is great for a lot of people, and I understand that if people want something now, they will go ahead and buy whatever it was. But I had a friend last weekend. I was heading to Costco, and they said, "Hey, can you check and see if they have any AirPods Pro there?
Yeah.
Because I'm looking for new ones, and they're delayed everywhere."
Yeah, that's right.
And I checked there when I was there, and no, they had second generation only.
Yeah.
And they said, never mind, I'll just wait.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some people will wait, but there is certainly a percentage of people who won't and will go to what they perceive of as the next best thing. And it can be a slight danger for Apple, but I don't think it's going to be huge.
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah.
It can be, yeah.
Anything else in the earnings report that you heard or saw that was of interest to you?
No, I mean, the stuff that Jason Snell does is always great.
Yeah, sixcolors.com. Definitely go to that one.
Yeah. His charts and all that kind of stuff. I mean, Jason is like the master of charts over there. So we always link to his stuff when he gets them all done, and they're just fantastic to look at. I mean, there's something about having visual that So that's about the only thing that I've really seen. I honestly, with this other stuff, I don't pay much attention because I think people are gonna blow it up or burn it down, depending on who they are. So, and it's usually the same suspects.
That's right. The thing that got me though, listening to the conference call yesterday, I don't understand these analysts who are trying to, I don't know, trick Tim Cook into talking about 5G. It's like, are you new here? Tim Cook wants to say, how long have you been on these calls? Come on, man. Apple's not going, doesn't matter how you phrase the question, Apple's not going to tell you about their future products. It's not going to happen ever. You've got unlimited time, you can ask 2 questions of Tim Cook, and you want to waste them on asking a question about 5G, something that's not going to happen for at least a year? Come on.
My favorite all-time analyst was Charlie Wolf.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember Charlie. Charlie was great. So Charlie, for those that weren't, I mean, those at that time the calls weren't open to the public like they are now. So Charlie would get on and he would ask the exact same question every time, whether and Steve would be there or and Charlie had a really gruff voice, and hey, Steve, congratulations on the stuff. Can you tell me about retail? What's going on with retail? No, Charlie, we're not going to tell you anything about that. And he said, okay, all right, great, thanks.
Exactly.
And that was it. And Charlie would be on his way.
Yeah, no kidding.
So yeah, that was always a classic. I always loved hearing Charlie on the calls.
It was like the local town drunk. Hey, Shawn, can you give me a loony, buddy? Thanks very much. All right, great.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Good talking to you, Steve.
Yeah. It was
Charlie was a smart guy, though.
Yeah, he was. Oh, hey, he was one of the. I don't know if he's passed away because he was fairly old or just retired. I never heard anything about him.
Charlie worked for Needham, I believe.
Yes, that's right. In Needham Capital. Overall, a huge quarter, a huge year. If you add up all the other things, they're the only big picture issue that Apple might have is the unfortunate instance of the coronavirus in China. It will affect the company to a certain degree. They've got manufacturing in Wuhan and other areas. They've got shipping. They've got stores. They've closed one store. They've limited the hours in others. I hope this doesn't become a big deal, but if it is, it'll affect everybody equally. Everybody who makes hardware that comes out of China, it will affect them all equally. And Cook and Luca Maestro, the CFO of the company, both said, we've got alternatives outside of China if we have to go that way. But that's the only bump in the road.
And let's not forget that, the most dangerous part of this is that people are actually dying.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly.
not just making products,
Yeah.
but there are people dying.
Yeah. It's a real concern. It's especially given the fact that, as we've seen over the life, if you've been following this over the last little while, the Chinese government isn't as forthcoming as maybe they should be when it comes to these numbers.
Right.
And a lot of folks may have gotten out of Wuhan. It happened here in Vancouver. Someone who'd left Wuhan before it was known how serious this was. He's been quarantined. His family is okay. He'll be okay. But how many other people like that made it out of Wuhan before? And there was a story that a plane load of people, I think from Iceland, landed, and they weren't quarantined. They weren't rechecked once they landed, and that seemed to be a dangerous thing. So this could spread widely if not contained by both the Chinese and others. Flights are being canceled. Right. People are being double checked when they land at international airports, Vancouver and Boston and LA and New York and those kinds. Hopefully, it will be contained very soon and not affect too many more people.
Yeah.
This was this past week was the 10th anniversary of the iPad launch. You were at that original iPad launch, weren't you?
I was.
I didn't go down there. I got an invite, but I couldn't afford it, and Jim wouldn't let me bunk on his floor, so I was screwed out of that experience.
Jim doesn't share.
Yeah, no kidding. Neither do I. No chance. There's no way am I going to share a room as a freaking grown-up. It's okay when you're in college, but no, I'm an adult now. I get my own freaking room. All right? If you can't afford it, either I don't go or you pony up some more money. End of story. So the iPad launch was 10 years ago. How much of that original launch do you remember, of that original excitement and or not, as the case may be?
Well, no, it was exciting because, and you really don't think about it until you realize, oh my God, it's been 10 years? Yep. Really? I mean, but there was excitement because it's another one of these instances where, Apple didn't invent the tablet. Nobody said that they did, but it was this crazy situation where you had Apple releasing something that again revolutionized this segment of the market in a way that nobody had ever seen.
Yeah.
And I mean, it really did make a huge difference. In the way that we work.
It was very much in line with a lot of the other things Apple does. Like you said, they didn't invent the tablet, but they popularized it and made it huge. As we've often said, there's no tablet market. There's the iPad, there's everything else. Just like Wi-Fi, just like USB, just like any number of other things that Apple did. I remember people saying
iPods, phones.
Yeah, right, yeah. I remember people saying, "Oh, it's just a big iPhone," and me saying, "Yes, good." Because even then, 10 years ago, my eyes were starting to go bad. You remember how small the iPhone was? When someone said to me, I'd give you a bigger screen iPhone, I was like, yeah, bring it on. And I was more than happy that if the iPad at that time had just been a big iPhone, I still would have loved it. I still would have thought it was a great idea because I had this extra screen real estate to do the things I was doing on my iPhone.
But the thing that, if they could have at the time released the iPad and iPad OS, that would have been a fundamental change in computing, I think, because, with that dedicated OS. But I don't think that they actually knew at the time how to do what they're doing right now.
Sure.
So, that's what comes with years of working on it. So,
but as
still a big deal.
The bringing it around to where I was going with this, as John Gruber wrote, the iPad awkwardly turns 10. He says the iPad hardware is undeniably great. Software is where the iPad has gotten lost. Exactly what you were saying. And he goes into some pretty interesting detail about this. And it's hard to, is it hard, do you believe, for Apple to completely bifurcate the iPad OS versus the iPhone OS to make it a truly separate one? Because the problem is going to be, how are you going to get developers to make two completely separate apps, both for the iPad and for the iPhone? That, I think, is maybe where Apple is having trouble being able to separate the two devices completely because of the software issue.
I don't know that there's that big of a software issue if a developer is maybe instead of iPhone and iPad, maybe that developer is making iPad and Mac. Because there are features that you can put into an iPad, like a full screen feature that you really can't have the same way with an iPhone, because of the work environment. So maybe that developer doesn't do the iPhone in the same way, but is able to double up because of Catalyst with iPad OS and Mac.
Yeah.
So, I don't think that it's that much of a problem, because people want more functional and different type of function on iPad than what they do on iPhone.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is that the iPad is now not just a big iPhone. We can see ways of using the iPad that are completely separate, completely different from the iPhone, but it feels like what the argument is that the iPad OS, as it's called now, is holding us back from that capability. Do you think that's true, that the OS now is the big sticking point?
It's the same with to me with iOS. I don't think that there's a real problem with the hardware. No. If I was going to pick something out, it would be with software.
Yes,
and software seems to be where things are starting to fall down a little bit. I mean, I haven't seen iOS software be as buggy as what I'm currently using.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever seen it that buggy, but I don't think I've ever seen it be as complex as it is either. So, you're dealing with a lot of complexity, a lot of technology, and Apple has put itself on a very strict schedule of yearly updates, and that's tough. That's very tough. So
the issue that Gruber brings up is that of multitasking and split screen and things like that.
Yep.
And those are OS issues, not app issues. The apps that we have on the iPad are generally pretty good. I enjoy using them on my iPad when I use them. I use my iPad a lot less than I used to. It's this discoverability of all the different functionality. I don't know about you, but I never use gestures on my iPad or my iPhone, the 3-finger swipe or things like that.
No, I don't do that either.
I don't do it on a Mac with a trackpad either. So that sort of stuff is lost on me. I never do split screens. I don't need to. It's not the way I use an iPad. You are someone who writes on occasion, at least on the iPad. Does that split screen multitasking stuff bother you as much as it seems to bother Gruber and his ilk?
Yeah, I mean, it does, because you just want things to be able to work, and it doesn't really.
Yeah.
So
it seems that it's certainly harder to do on the iPad than you think it should be, I guess is the way to describe it. Is that true?
I'm sorry?
It feels like those kind of things are harder than they should be on the iPad.
Well, see, that's exactly it. I mean, there are times with the software, that the hardware can do it. Yeah. There are times with the software where, for some reason, it just doesn't want to do it.
Yeah.
It doesn't want to get done. So that's the frustrating part, because it should work, but it, for whatever reason, it doesn't. And then, the instances of multitasking, I have stuff with, force tapping on some messages and things that just, it always worked before, but now it doesn't. I mean, and it's brand new phone, so it's not the hardware, it's the software, so I can't figure out some of the stuff that's going wrong. And there's all kinds of, little issues like that just come up. So yeah, if I was going to put any blame on anything, it would be software, not hardware.
If that's the case, then is the solution completely separating the iPad OS from the iPhone OS to make them completely separate operating systems?
Or is that going to make it worse?
Yeah, true. Good point.
Because then they have another one that they have to deal with.
Yeah.
And
that we've got to update and we've got to work around and all of those things. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So I think that the bones of having two OS is fine. That's a fine strategy. But, yes, they need to be able to offer iPad developers more functionality in a different kind of way than what they offer iOS. So, I mean, if the core of the OSs are the same and one has a problem, well, the other's going to have a problem.
As Gruber said in his article, the iPad at 10 is, to me, a grave disappointment. Not because it's bad, but because it's not bad. It's great even. But because great though it is in so many ways, overall it has fallen far short of the grand potential it showed on day one. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that he's right, because it did have. We thought of the iPad like we thought of the iPhone.
Yes.
And we sat around kind of waiting for that to happen, and it didn't.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it really has yet. I mean, it has in some instances, but not like the iPhone. But that's how, when we first saw the iPad, we thought, here comes another blockbuster.
Yeah.
And it really hasn't been a blockbuster. It's been very good, but there have been things over the years that have held it back. And, I mean, people try something like they try an iPad maybe in year 3 or 4, and it's just not what they expected it would be. And then they don't go back. I mean, that doesn't happen to everybody, but it does happen. So, you just get a bad taste in your mouth for something. And I'm not sure of what's going to happen when iPad continues to grow and they manage the OS. Because that could be a huge thing for them.
One of the issues that folks like Gruber brought up is this idea of discoverability. How do people learn how to do slide over or multitasking and things like that? How much of that is, I mean, Apple's put the information out there that's in Keynote, it's on the website, it's in places that you can find them. How much responsibility is of the user to say to themselves, hey, I got a new iPad or I got a new iPad OS, let me go and learn this stuff? I mean, Apple can't just, when you turn on your new iPad, have a screen pop up and say, hey, here's how to do slide over, or here's how to do multitasking. The user has to take some responsibility. We saw so many people respond to a Gruber on Twitter that said, I didn't even know I could do slide over. Well, if you've been paying attention, you'd at least know that you could do it, even if you didn't know how to do it, because Apple showed it in the keynote. It's on the website. It's one of the videos that they have that you can watch. The user's got to take some responsibility when it comes to learning this kind of stuff.
I agree. I mean, education is not just a one-way street. I mean, Apple puts the materials out there, but you have to be willing to educate yourself on how to do things. And I mean, if we look at something like music, I will look and research and find videos and find articles and everything else about how to use an EQ or a compressor, and what I should be looking for. But the company will put things out, but then other people will put things out. So it's up to me as a user to take those materials and put them to use. And at the end of it, I know how to use an EQ to properly do kick drum. Now I know how to do that. And from now on, I will have the general principles it doesn't matter what EQ I use. I have the general principles to be able to do that. So I think that's what people need to do with everything they do. I mean, if you do a search for, iPad gestures in Google, I'm sure to come up with 1 million articles.
Yeah, that's right.
So if you don't know it's there and Apple has the information there for you to read, then I think that's on you.
For me, the iPad has become less useful because the iPhone has become more useful. I remember the first iPad. That was the last time I lined up for an Apple product at 6 a.m. was in Portland, Oregon, the day of the iPhone launch. Haven't done it since, but I haven't needed to or wanted to. But when I was thinking about the iPad 10 anniversary and thinking, how do I use my iPad now compared to how I use my iPhone? When the iPad came out, I said, it's going to save me all kinds of battery life because I'm using my iPhone less. But the iPad hasn't progressed in a way that the iPhone has. I want almost every single new iPhone because of new features, new hardware, and new things I can do with it, AR and cameras and that kind of stuff.
Right.
I don't feel that's true of the iPad for me personally. I'm not an artist, so I don't need the Apple Pencil to draw on with the iPad Pro. There's just not enough. And then the other issue is my old iPad still works just fine for what I want to use it for. When I want to sit in bed and read with my Pocket app or watch some Netflix videos on the iPad so I don't disturb my wife or whatever, and play a game, that's fine for that kind of thing. But there's nothing more beyond that for me personally.
Yeah. No, I get that with the iPad for a lot of people. And, there are other people that are exactly the opposite. And I think those are the two extremes. People like Federico who, he freaks out about everything iPad.
Yep.
And I'm not there. But I'm also not in the camp where, I don't care if a new iPad comes out.
Yep.
I definitely want a new iPad because of the way that I use it. But, I'm not putting my entire workflow on an iPad. And, I said long ago when the iPad came out that I am not one that is going to force something into my workflow.
Yes, exactly.
My workflow has been going on for, 25, 26 years now. I don't need to force something in there. But if something naturally fits, then hey, I'm all game for that.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
let's move on. Neil Young is wrong about the MacBook Pro. Our Canadian singer-songwriter, interesting guy. But he said that the MacBook Pro had Fisher-Price audio quality. And Jim, you took offense to that.
Well, I don't know if I took offense or
you said his comments are completely wrong and nonsensical, that he's lost touch with reality. Come on.
Well, I do. I believe that. I said it. I believe it. If you look, I guess what bothered me the most about Neil's comments was that none of it actually made any sense to me. And that's the thing that bothered me. When I first read the article, I thought, what the hell is he talking about?
Yeah.
Because it made no sense. And I think I summed up my overall thoughts by saying that Neil took his well-documented hatred of digital and kind of argued that analog was better and that the MacBook sucks in the same sentence, but those aren't the same things. When you talk about, he talked about the Mac's lack of a decent DAC, digital to analog converter. Yeah. So I don't know.
And what that means is getting audio out of the hardware and onto recording tape. Is that what he's talking about?
Basically, yeah. Or being able to, plug your digital stuff into your digital stuff and then get, your analog stuff out.
Okay.
So, Neil is saying you can't do that with the Mac. You need other things. Mm. Well, I don't know a single person who doesn't have other things to do that with. So what does the MacBook Pro really have to do with what he's talking about? Almost everybody is going to, whether you get a cheap USB device or a USB mic or something, you're going to use something to get audio in and audio out of your Mac. And people, even if they do record albums on their MacBook Pro, they don't record it with the internal mics and the internal speakers. I mean, all I have to do is walk in, and I realize this is, I mean, a lot of people have Apollos, but I have an Apollo 8 from Universal Audio, and they are some of the best mic pre's in the business. So when I plug that in, it's plugged into my iMac right now, but if I plug that into my MacBook Pro, I basically have some of the same gear that studios are using. Yeah. because studios use the same piece of gear that I have.
Yeah.
So what is Neil's problem? He just doesn't seem to make an argument that stands up. Now, let's look at his audio argument. He says analog audio is better than digital audio.
Yeah. Okay.
So what he's actually talking about, because I've followed this through the years of audio, if you listen to an old album, one of the ones that I like to bring up the most is if you listen to Led Zeppelin, Led Zeppelin 4, listen to Stairway to Heaven.
Yeah.
When Stairway to Heaven starts to play and it's just the guitar, there is so much, you feel the room around the music. Like there's so much room around the music. And I mean, literally, like there's headspace in there, you know, and as the song progresses and grows, that fills with more music until the very end when it's just pounding. And that fills up the entire track, like the entire waveform. But what happens now, that was analog. What happens now is that even at the start of a song, it's pretty much as loud as the end of the song.
Okay.
So there is no feeling of that headroom, no feeling of space in the music. And is he right? Yeah. But it's not the way that it was recorded. It's the way that it's mixed for the most part and mastered. And that whole process, if anybody wants to go look it up, is called the loudness wars, where we perceive, and everybody does it, we perceive music to be better when it's louder.
Yes. So
what they started to do, what producers and engineers started to do, was to mix songs at like the max volume, and people would like it more. Yeah. And they did, but it's all psychological. In actual fact, if you listen to an old Zeppelin album or something like that, or an old song on an album where they didn't do this, I find it a very pleasant experience to be able to do it. But it's not just because of digital. I mean, there were other things that you could do with tape that were well known. Like you could hit tape really hard. I mean, like you could clip it on tape, make it go into the red zone. And what that would do on tape is add saturation to the piece of music that you're recording. So in some instances, that was a really good thing to do. You know, hit the tape really hard. It would add saturation to it and give it this characteristic that, you know, you otherwise wouldn't have in the song. Yeah. Well, in digital, if you hit a digital thing and make it clip, it's just going to sound like junk.
Yeah, it's going to be clipped.
You know, it's going to sound like it clips. Yeah. And by clipping, I mean, you know, people. You heard somebody yell too loud into a tape recorder, and it just sounds muffled. That's clipping. So in digital, there is no way to add those types of things. Now, over the years, companies like Universal Audio have come out with plugins like saturators that and tape plugins that give it that feel and that sense that you get from the old analog. So, I mean, clearly, if you talk to a lot of old time music people, they will all say they loved all of the old gear, but they don't want to work with it now.
It just seems that Young is painting everything with the same brush, as you said. Right. He's a well-known hatred of digital, and he's using the MacBook Pro as a straw man in his argument that it's all by itself is a piece of crap. No one would record an album just using the internal microphone and the external speakers of a MacBook Pro. And he's probably right in that regard, but no one actually does that. We've seen videos of Billie Eilish and her brother recording stuff on their MacBook Pros, and that becomes an album. I mean, you can do what Young is saying you can't do. So it feels like he's just it's sad to say this, but it feels like he's just an old man yelling at clouds.
I know. I have to say that I love Neil Young.
Yeah.
I love his music. I think he's an amazing songwriter. He has influenced me in the way that I like to play guitar, so many things. But he is so wrong with what he's talking about right now. And, people pointed out to me yesterday that I didn't point out in my article about Pono.
Yeah.
His music player and service.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't, because I don't think that was his message. Like, you should buy my stuff, because that's all
relevant.
The whole point of the article that I wrote yesterday was to say, I don't understand what you're even getting at here, because you make no sense at all. You make absolutely no sense. The arguments that you're saying against digital and the MacBook Pro are two completely separate things. I mean, none of it just makes any sense. And that's what I don't get. It said it had Fisher Price audio. Well, that's not true. I mean, the MacBook Pro has great speakers, 6 speakers. It has 3 mics. It will record if you want to sit down. And I've talked to a lot of people that have sat down with, including me, an iPhone or a Mac, just press record in GarageBand and get a song down. That song's not going to the album. I'll get the song idea down. And Neil, you can't tell me Neil Young hasn't done the same thing in front of a cassette recorder.
Yeah, no kidding.
Through the years. Now, did that go straight to the album? No, of course not. He then recorded it, and that's what people do now. They, some people, I've had people in well-known bands, big bands, have told me they used to call their voicemail and hum in it, hum the song. They call their voicemail at home, hum the song. And then when they get home, from a trip or whatever, they could have 5 or 10 messages there with song ideas. And and at that time it was a cassette tape, they'd listen to it and get it down. Now people use like voice memos and stuff like that on the iPhone and hum a song in there.
Billie Eilish just won a buttload of Grammys on the awards this past weekend. She did it out of
what does she do?
She did it out of older brother's bedroom studio in their parents' home. They, according to Pro Sound Network interview, they had a $200 set of Yamaha near-field monitors, $500 subwoofer, Universal Audio Apollo 8 interface is what you mentioned, Apple's Logic Pro 10 on an iMac, and she recorded her vocals with an Audio-Technica A2020 mic. All that stuff is affordable to almost everybody who wants to be a musician. And
absolutely.
So Neil Young can go pound sand because he's wrong.
The most expensive thing in that whole group, and I can pretty much guarantee you this, would be the Apollo.
Apollo 8.
But the Apollo was going to give you more than what you could ever imagine. So anytime somebody asks me, what type of interface should I buy, say, okay, here's top of the line. If you're serious about this, this is what you get. And you can go from there to bottom of the line for whatever that is. But, and if Neil wants to argue that analog and digital and all that kind of stuff, he should go talk to Universal Audio. The guy that invented Universal Audio did it. He was recording Sinatra and the Stones and those people, and he invented like the delay. He would put a rubber hose coiled up in a box, run the audio through the hose, and that's how it delayed. Seriously. Now his sons took that business and took it from an analog business to a digital business. So Neil, you want to go talk to the Putnams? I'm sure they'd be more than happy to talk to you, because they are proof positive right there that this stuff can be done. And guess what? Their father was recording long before you.
Yeah, no kidding. I know you'll talk more about this on your podcast, The Dalrymple Report, with Dave Mark. You guys do that on Wednesdays or Thursdays, usually available up on Fridays on the iTunes store. Thanks, Jim.
All right. Thanks, Shawn.
See ya.
Bye. Welcome back, folks. Thank you guys very much for joining us here this Wednesday evening, January 29th, show number 1242. This is the Starting Point photography segment of the show. Got a really interesting comment. Did a class this past weekend and had one of the students ask me, they were going through the menu system on their cameras. It was really funny. There were 4 people. There were 2 Canon folks, 4 people and me, so 5. 2 Canon folks, 2 Nikon folks, and 1 Pentax person. And none of us could help the others with the menu systems on the phone, on the cameras.
Yeah, you had a bit of a mix.
Because they were all different. Even from brand to brand, the menus are confusing and different for everybody. So one of the things I told them was, make sure you read your manual so you at least know where stuff is. So one of the ladies is going through her Canon, and she says, "What does AWB stand for?" And I said, "Never mind." And she went, "Oh." I was just teasing her, but I said, one of my philosophies of teaching is don't learn too much. I can teach you, I can tell you everything you need to know about a camera in a 6-hour class. We had 2 3-hour sessions. But you're not going to learn 6 hours worth of stuff. A lot of it's going to leak out of your brain. You're going to forget it. It's not intensive, but it's a lot of information given over a long period of time. And what I try to get students to do is to focus on just doing 1 or 2 things. And I want to give them the overall concepts of photography and then give them a basic understanding of a bunch of other things. But then we're going to zero in on 2 things. And for me, it's aperture priority and shutter priority. Because I think those are the 2 easiest things for a beginner to conceptualize in their heads, because they're the easiest things to show, and the easiest things for them to practice as well. It's really easy to tell someone, hey, put your camera in aperture priority mode and make your aperture number as low as it can and start taking pictures. And then make it as high as you can and take pictures and see what the difference is. So AWB, for those of you who know, stands for auto white balance. White balance is a way of measuring the color temperature of light and telling your camera, this is the kind of light I'm in right now, so adjust yourself for that light. But what that means is there's sunlight, bright sunlight, there's cloudy skies, there are white balance settings for tungsten light, for flash, for fluorescent light, for all that kind of stuff. And it's really not necessary for a beginner to know that stuff. Even for a lot of pros and experts, I never bother setting my white balance. Ever. I'm always on auto white balance because I shoot in RAW. And because I shoot in RAW, I know I can go into my editing app afterwards and change the white balance if the camera got it wrong. It's really easy to do. You take a picture indoors, usually say in a office, or your home and the color is really yellow and you can't figure out why it's yellow, it's because your white balance is off. The camera didn't recognize the color temperature of that light and screwed up. So everything looks yellow or looks overly blue or things like that. When you shoot raw, it's easy to fix that kind of stuff. So I don't want to confuse a beginner by giving them one more variable to think about. I want you to think about aperture priority. So it's all you think about is aperture, nothing else. When you're shooting aperture priority, your camera says, okay, you're going to control the aperture. I'll control everything else. I'll control shutter speed and exposure and ISO and white balance and all those other kind of things. You think about one thing, let your camera think about everything else. Same with shutter priority. You tell the camera, I want to take control of the shutter speed, and the camera says, that's fine, no problem. I'll figure out everything else. So it's the idea of don't learn too much. Focus on one or two concepts, do those, and get really good at those one or two concepts. So I came up with a list of other things that I literally wouldn't talk to a beginner about. And one of them is manual mode. One of the ladies asked me, should I shoot in manual mode? I said, no, do not shoot manual mode. Unless you're already a good photographer and know what manual mode is and does, you're just going to just be a gigantic exercise in frustration for you.
Intimidating.
Because manual mode means you've got to take control of aperture, of shutter, of ISO, of exposure, of all those things. And unless you understand how all those things work with each other, you're going to screw something up. And you're not going to end up taking 75 pictures or 10 and quit. It's just, there's no point. Later on, as you become a better photographer, as you become more confident in your photography and in your camera, and knowing how aperture and shutter and ISO and exposure and all that kind of stuff interrelate with each other, then you can look at a scene and go, okay, in manual mode, I need to have my aperture set to this and my shutter speed set to this. This is the kind of light I'm in, so I'll set my ISO to this, my white balance to that. And you can do that stuff instinctively. It happens automatically for a lot of people. But as a beginner, I've seen classes that say, this is a beginner class. We'll teach you everything you know about manual mode.
Oh.
Jesus, don't take that class.
People will give up photography.
Exactly. Because of the frustration that comes with trying to figure out all those variables simultaneously while also trying to capture an image. So yeah, manual mode. If anyone says that if you think you're a beginner and someone offers you to teach manual mode, run away. Do not give them any money at all, because it's just gonna be a waste of time. I had one of the ladies in the class, Jane, the lady with the dog trainer, called me up and sent me an email the next day and said, I really want to get into flash. Can you recommend a flash that I could, an external flash? Because I explained that the on-camera flash is generally going to be a crappy flash and you shouldn't use it. So she got it in her head, not because I said anything, but got it in her head that, well, she should use an external flash. So the email was, can you recommend a flash for me? I said, no, I'm not going to, because that's just another variable for you. Right now, I want you to focus on getting good images in good light, because that way you'll be encouraged to take more images and create better photos. If you start trying to use an external flash, first of all, it's how to set up the external flash on your camera. It's not as simple as when you have a on-camera flash. You push the button, the flash pops up, picture gets taken. No problem, easy peasy. When you've got an external flash, if you ever look at the back of an external flash, there's all kinds of buttons and dials on the back of that thing. Almost as many as are on your camera. And those are for power settings and all kinds of other things about when it flashes. Front camera flash, rear camera flash, all kinds of things that, again, are just going to be so many more variables tossed into your photography. Sorry, my ear is itchy. So many different variables that are tossed into your photography that, again, it'll be just an exercise in frustration. I recommended a couple of inexpensive flashes, but I said you really shouldn't buy these because right now, frankly, you're not a good enough photographer to understand flash. Flash is a whole different subject, it's a whole different class. Light in general is a whole different class. And so you're just going to make yourself crazy trying to figure out aperture and shutter priority and all that kind of stuff, and then throw flash in on top of it. See, MacMan says, I use my SB600 in TTL mode. You know what TTL mode is?
talk to you later or something?
Through the lens.
Oh, sorry.
So it reads.
I thought it was some kind of a.
There's no need to be sorry. You're a beginner. You wouldn't be expected to know.
Well, I would never be using my SB 600, whatever.
It's that kind of flash is for when you get more knowledgeable about photography and more creative about photography. You're shooting in particular kinds of conditions that you know I need a flash for, but you already know that because you're already a good enough photographer to know this stuff. You've already got aperture and shutter already nailed. You know exactly what those are, but you need a little extra light, so you can use a flash to do that. But as a rank beginner who's not taking good photos now, I wouldn't recommend a flash at all for anybody. One of the ladies asked about Photoshop, and the thing I say about Photoshop is remember Photoshop is the single most complicated program a consumer is going to use. I mean, unless you work at NASA, it's a very, very involved, complicated, dense application. If you already use Photoshop, then go ahead and use it for your photos. But keep in mind that Photoshop is a pixel editing application, as opposed to things like Lightroom, which are image editing. So pixels, little itty bitty bits. That's why you can in Photoshop you can take someone's head and put it on someone else's body and do all kinds of fancy illustration type stuff. But Lightroom and other apps like it are apps designed to edit your image. So I would much rather tell you, don't buy Photoshop. Don't get a subscription to Photoshop or buy a copy of Photoshop because it's too complicated a program for a beginner, and especially a beginner photographer. Photoshop Elements, not Lightroom, but Elements is a very, very good app for editing. Photos is an okay app for editing. There's a bunch of other ones that I'll talk to the class about, but Photoshop is not the application. If you don't already know Photoshop, it's not the application that you want to edit your images in. MacMan says, I know actual rocket scientists who hate using Photoshop. Exactly. It's an evil program. I've used Photoshop since Photoshop 1. They used to give Photoshop away. When you bought a scanner, there was a copy of Photoshop 1 in the scanner. That's how long I've been using it. But they've just built things on top of it for so long. It's been 25 years now that Photoshop's been out there, that it's now this monster of an app. So you can do amazing things, but the learning curve in Photoshop is ever steep. It's a very, very difficult app to learn. Metering modes. What metering modes are ways to tell the camera specifically what kind of light you want it to look at. Metering modes are generally what's called average, which means your camera will take a light reading of an average of the whole viewfinder that you see. There's center weighted, which means your camera will do a square or a rectangle in the center of your viewfinder and do the light from that. And then there's spot metering, which is one single dot, and you're telling your camera, okay, I want you to meter light off of that. I'm talking about light metering. You don't need to know that as a beginner. You don't need to know what light metering is. You just let the camera figure that stuff out. It gets very complicated trying to figure out these kinds of things. It's another variable on top of things that if you don't need to do it, don't do it just yet. It is something, though, that I would encourage you to learn about fairly quickly after you feel confident with aperture and shutter priority modes. Light metering is probably the thing I would teach next because it's very helpful, along with things like exposure compensation. What'll happen is it's a snowy day, and you're shooting your dog on the snow. So the dog is running through the snow, and you're taking pictures of it. Your camera sees the whole average scene as what's called 18% gray. So you'll take that picture, and the snow will be gray because your camera sees a black dog and white snow. So it raises the brightness of the dog and lowers the brightness of the snow, and you get a shitty photo. And you can compensate for that with light metering and exposure compensation. But until you learn all the other things you need to know, aperture priority, shutter priority, you don't want to mess with those kinds of things. I've had an email from someone asking me about HDR, or high dynamic range. They saw it on their iPhone, and they were wondering about being able to use it on their camera. That's not as complicated as some of the other things. HDR, shooting in HDR is actually fairly easy because most cameras can set up what's called bracketing, which means they'll take a overexposed photo, they'll take an underexposed photo, and they'll take a properly exposed photo, and then they'll merge them together. That's what your iPhone does. If you have HDR turned on your iPhone in an instant does exactly that. It looks at the brightest spot in the photo, takes a picture of it, looks at the darkest spot in the photo, takes a picture of it, and then it does an average, and then merges the three together, in theory giving you a more realistic portrait of the light. HDR gets complicated when you start bringing things into software and then merging HDR photos in software, doing brackets of 9 photos to get even more HDR. And HDR can be overused. You may have seen photos that look really, really contrasty or really blown out. You recognize that it's a landscape, but the landscape is just so weird looking. That's HDR done badly. There's a lot of bad HDR out there. It's a photographic technique that you don't need to know about as a beginner, so you ignore those kinds of things. And finally, the old classic of which is better, Nikon, Canon, Sony. As a beginner, don't even get into that conversation. Buy the camera that feels best for you and your hands and your budget. Every company out there makes a really good beginner DSLR or mirrorless camera. Sony does. Olympus does. Nikon, Canon, Pentax. They all make a good beginner camera. Just pick one. Pick one that fits into your budget. If you enjoy photography, it won't be your last camera. It's very much like we always talk about motorcycles. Your first motorcycle won't be your last motorcycle unless it kills you. Let's not talk about that. Mm-hmm. But what you'll do is, as you get to be better and as you get to know yourself as a photographer, you get to learn what kind of photography you like, whether it's portrait or landscape or action or that kind of stuff. Then that'll help you focus a bit more on the specific kind of camera you want. Maybe you're better suited to a mirrorless camera. Maybe you like the long lenses of a Canon. Maybe you like the new sports of a Nikon. But right now, as a beginner, it doesn't matter. The only time it matters is if, and I give this advice to everybody, do you have a friend who's a professional photographer who'll loan you his lenses? Buy his camera. If you know a pro Canon shooter and he's got a bunch of lenses he'll loan you, buy a Canon. Buy a Rebel XTI from your local Best Buy or London Drugs. It'll be under $500, and his lenses will work on your camera. And that way you get to play around with some pro lenses. If your buddy's a Nikon user, buy a Nikon. That's the only time I tell folks a specific brand of camera to buy. As you get to be a better photographer, you'll figure out, okay, I need this in my camera, better macro or faster autofocus or whatever it is, and then you'll buy the camera manufacturer that fits those kinds of things. Hopefully that's a little bit of help for you about things not to think about when you are being a photographer. What are you laughing at? Huh? What are you laughing at?
Things not to think about.
Things not to think about. Well, there's so much. There's so much stuff to think about in photography. I try to simplify it for beginners. I try to get it down to just the basics for beginners and tell them, here's the things that you can focus on that will bring immediate results and immediately get you to be a better photographer and have you have more fun being a photographer. Did you know that yesterday was National Plan for Vacation Day?
No.
It's not. It was just it's just a made up thing. But it's kind of a neat idea. January 28th. Christmas is over. We're a month past Christmas. Start thinking about your summer or spring vacation. I kind of like the idea because it gives you something to look forward to, especially for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere who have these cloudy, rainy, dreary days. I remember last year, this time, us being very excited about thinking about Lisbon and planning for that and what are we going to bring, what are we going to do, that kind of stuff. And so it kind of gets you through the dog days of January and February and into March. It's useless asking you this question. No, it's not. If you had the money to be comfortable and go somewhere for 3 days, that's not Australia because you cheat, where would you go for 3 days?
For 3 days.
For 3 days. You're no. Let's make it 4. It's a long weekend. You're gonna take a Monday. You take Friday off.
New York.
Monday. For a 4-day weekend.
Yeah, if I had the money and it'd be fun.
That's not a bad idea. You're not a gambler, so Vegas.
I don't want to go to
be,
Vegas. I have no interest.
Yeah, but I think I didn't think you were going to say that, but I think you're right. 4 days because it's easy enough to get there in one day. You leave in the morning, probably get there mid-afternoon on the Friday, and then you have a little bit of a nap, and then you go out Friday evening, and you get Saturday,
you're out
Sunday.
all the time.
Yeah, and then catch a red eye back home.
Yeah, because that would be probably just the right amount for me to be loving it and completely in awe of it. And then after a time, I think it will be good for me to come home.
And you, with all your traveling, had never been to New York, have you?
No.
Which surprised me.
Been to New York State. I just haven't been to New York City.
How would you have gotten... I mean, you had a choice, not a choice, but you went to Buffalo, New York, which is a shitty-ass town. Why wouldn't you have gone to New York? Catch the train and gone into the big city?
Because I was visiting a friend in Buffalo.
So why wouldn't you and your friend go to New York City?
I forget now. It's just, I was on my way. I think I had to get out of the States, actually. Anyways.
I know that feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed to me that it would just been drawn like a magnet to go to, this story.
I'm not quite sure why. He was working, and maybe it was just, I don't know.
It's definitely something I want to do.
We went to Niagara Falls.
Yeah. Which is beautiful on the 100 yards either side of the falls, but up that hill and all that shit outside of Niagara Falls in the town is fucking awful.
Horrible.
It
but
is
anyway.
awful. You rarely see the photos of the city of Niagara Falls. The falls are spectacular and beautiful. The Canadian ones are much prettier than the American ones. And I'm not just bragging, it's true. The American one's a bunch of rocks. But the town, so I think it's the government.
Jeff's in Buffalo. I was just kidding. Sorry. Sorry.
I
actually had fun in Buffalo.
I don't care. It's still a shitty town. But there's something like there's an exclusion zone. I think it's 100 yards or whatever, maybe half a kilometer from the river on either side of it that the government of Canada or the government of Ontario controls, and they keep that pristine. It's like parkland. Beautiful walking. I remember getting off the train. This was back in college. Getting off the train and walking to the falls, and it was a 3 or 4 mile walk, and then hearing the falls getting louder and louder and louder until you got there and you went, geez, you can barely hear yourself. It's so loud. And then we took the bus up the hill to go find a hotel. Oh my God. It was the skeeviest place.
And didn't it used to be like a honeymoon, a famous honeymoon?
Still is. Still is. That's why half the hotels have got honeymoon suites and heart-shaped beds and heart-shaped jacuzzis, but it's awful. Awful, awful, awful. I still remember 30 plus years later how awful Niagara Falls is. I'd never, ever go there again.
Sherry says her boyfriend of 3 years lives there and
still haven't
gone.
Sherry, Buffalo's pretty far from New York City. Yeah, I think it is.
It wasn't on the, But I was there. I had chicken wings. There was a huge snowstorm.
Yes, well, those two things are Buffalo.
Very much Buffalo. Yeah,
but
it's fun.
Yeah, I think that's a good choice. Going to, we've talked this before. I've never had any interest in Hawaii.
No, I'm not going to go to Hawaii.
I might, if you're going for just a quickie little vacation, I might pick Hawaii on that. If it's
not very long.
Well, 4 days, yeah. But I mean, if it's 4 days of
you're on the beach, you're not going to want
scuba
to
diving
leave.
and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Mexico and all inclusive in Mexico, but not nearly as much.
Nah.
New York would be probably the most fun, definitely. So yeah, yesterday was National Plan Your Vacation Day, which cracked me up. Mark Pullman says, a happy long-time listener since the Mac Show. As some actor put it, you've come a long way, baby. Donated $30 for us.
Oh, that's
he
very
said, I wanted to wait until after the holidays while you probably have a lull in donations, and he sent us $30. Thank you for it. Mark Pullman.
Oh, thank you, Mark.
South Carolina.
Oh, how lovely. I've heard it's very beautiful in South Carolina.
It is, especially the coastline.
Mm-hmm.
Steve Kane, I've got an iPhone 6S running iOS 12.4.1. I intend to buy an iPhone 11 today or tomorrow and transfer everything over to the new iPhone. Would it be better to update my current iPhone 6 to iOS 13. Sorry, my iPhone 6 from iOS 12 to iOS 13. Before transferring to the new phone, would it be better leave the iPhone 6 at 12 and just do the transfer to the new iPhone 11? Steve, I don't have any basis for this, but my brain says update the 6, do a backup, and then do the transfer to the 11 from the 6. Because what will happen is No, I take that back. I take it back. Because I don't know what OS your iPhone would have. It's going to have iOS 12, but which version of iOS 12? The reason why I say this is if you update to the latest, greatest iOS 12 on your iPhone 6, and then you buy an iPhone 11 that it hasn't been updated to that, you'll be downgrading. You know what I mean? You'd be going from 12.4.1 to maybe 12.3. And I don't know if you could even do that. You would have to upgrade the new iPhone as well. So, yeah, do a backup and then do a restore to the iPhone 11. Folks in this chat room agree or say anything different?
13 doesn't run on 6, says Sherry.
Okay.
And then so MacMan says just do the transfer.
Yeah, just do the transfer. I think that would make the most sense is just do the transfer. Robert Poland, I just got another spam email signed as if for me. Is there a cure for this crap? No. Do you ever get those?
I'm sorry, what?
You get emails that are spam but have your name in the from field and the to field?
Oh, I have a couple of times, yeah. Not very often.
There's not a lot you can do about that, Robert. Spam is a problem that's gotten a lot less, but is still bad enough to piss you off on a regular basis. But what's happening is the bad guys are spoofing your email. Your email has been scraped from somewhere, from some website or from somewhere, and they put your email address in the from field to try to fake out your spam filters. Because you obviously don't filter for your own address.
Oh.
The only thing you could do is if those spam emails have a common word or body word or phrase in the body of the email, you could filter on that. But that's dangerous because you don't want to filter on the word, donuts, because maybe you want to get emails from donuts. So, there's not a lot you can do except just delete the stuff. Get a good spam filter. I use Spam Sieve. That does all my spam filtering. It's still not 100% perfect. I still have to delete some stuff manually. So, our friend Jason Painter in Sydney, Australia. Apple most likely killed Dashboard because they know that very few users used it. I never use it. I use it every day, and this is the reason I haven't updated from Mojave. I'm having trouble finding a similar app for that will work with Catalina. I'm wondering if the listeners have any ideas. I sent this, Jason, to Twitter and got no response. I don't know that there's a dashboard replacement for macOS in Catalina. It may have been killed dead so much that no one else has created. But if anyone does know, and if your listeners out there do know, please send me an email, Shawn at Your Mac Life Show, and I'll forward it on to our good friend Jason Painter, who's looking for this information. I want to send a shout out to Jeff M. Jeff M. hasn't been in our IRC room for a very, very long time, so I'm very happy to see Jeff M. in the chat room. Glad to see you drop by, Jeff, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.
Where does Jeff live?
Jeff, I don't know. Ask Jeff.
Where do you live, Jeff?
You could type it in, too. I'm kidding. MacMan says, I just let Gmail handle spam filtering. Dave D says 4 days, probably wine country in California, Sonoma area.
That's nice.
Very pretty. I've driven through there. It's just absolutely gorgeous. Who's that? MacMan says Hawaii is on my personal bucket list. It's never been a place I have any interest in. One of the reasons why is being from Nova Scotia on the East Coast. For East Coasters, their tropical area is the Caribbean. For West Coasters, it seems to be Hawaii. So I've never had any interest in. And now with Melissa, why go to Hawaii when we can go just a little
Just
bit
an extra
further?
12 hours on the plane and you're in Australia.
No big deal, just 12 hours.
It's fine.
And then
You're
we're
asleep by then. Or
then we're in Australia where we can surf. We can scuba dive the Great Barrier Reef
and this
see
magnificent
friends and family,
coast.
and koalas, and that. So, yeah, I don't think we'll ever go to Hawaii. Where did Jeff say he was from?
Providence,
Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Cute little place. So that's it, folks. Thank you guys very much for joining us here on the show. Appreciate you guys being here each and every week. Thanks to our good friend Jim Dalrymple of The Loop at loopinsight.com for pre-recording the show. Thanks you guys for being tuned in live. We love the live audience, so we love when you guys come and hang out with us. Until next week, as always, I've been Shawn King.
I'm Melissa King.
And you've been listening to Your Mac Life. See ya!
Bye.
We did it right this time, didn't we?
I always did it right.